Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Are you ready for the future? If not, Bob Johansen, our guest, can help. Bob, welcome to our show.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.
Bob, you have written a book, Full Spectrum Thinking. And I'd like you to start off by telling us a little bit about your background so our audience knows where you're coming from.
Sure. So I grew up in the Midwest. I was a high school basketball player, went to Illinois on a scholarship and was not good enough to be a pro. Went to graduate school and learned, first of all, I got a divinity school degree in world religions, and then I did a PhD in sociology at Northwestern. And as I was going into that program, I thought I'd become a professor of sociology of religion. And then the internet happened. And I got completely taken by this concept of connecting people. So I kind of grew up with the internet. I went to Silicon Valley before it was called that. And I focused my whole career on making sense of this kind of wild connectivity that we now have blossoming.
And you're very modest to say that. You told us about the early days, but you're also president of something called the Institute for the Future. Is that correct?
Right. So I got to go there in the early days. This is the longest running futures think tank in the world. So we've been doing this for 52 years now. And I got to be the president for 8 years. And then I asked our board to let me go back to what I love to do, which is write books and do things like this and do what we call custom forecasts, which are usually for the CEO of a big company to try to identify what are the big external disruptors for them thinking 10 years ahead.
So you're not a psychic, you're not a magician, and just for our audience, because sometimes when people say, I'm going to tell you the future, my first question would be, give me 6 lotto numbers and we can split. But, but you do tell major companies, they come to you. In fact, I think one was a major university, correct? Southern New Hampshire?
Yeah, so that SNHU is I think now the world's largest online university, and we just did a custom forecast for them on the College Student of the Year 2030. And they were one of the few universities that were actually prepared for online learning and shelter in place the way it played out in the crisis. But anyway, the way you evaluate a psychic or a fortune teller is, does the forecasted future actually happen? That because they're predicting the future. That's not what we do. What we do is what we call a forecast, which is plausible, internally consistent, and provocative. And it's designed so that our foresight provokes your insight that leads to your action. So the evaluation for us is not whether the forecasted future happens, it's whether the forecasted future provokes an insight, a kind of an aha. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. You can't unsee the insight. So we're really in the insight business. It just happens that we use foresight, 10 years ahead looking back, foresight to provoke your insight.
And I mentioned that because I want our audience to know we're not giving any psychic readings here today, and this is not magic or a stage performance. This is an institute that businesses go to for advice of what's coming for the future, what to expect and how to react. Am I correct?
Right, exactly. So, basically what we are is a think tank. We have about 50 core people who are there all the time, and they're from all around the world, and then maybe another few hundred around the world that we draw on for specific projects. So, you could think of us as about halfway between a university and a consultancy. Many of us have PhDs, but we're more interested in deep academic knowledge, but then become kind of skeptical or questioning of your basic training and deep knowledge in something else, because we want people who fail gracefully at the edge of their knowledge, because as futurists, we're always at the edge of our knowledge.
Now, your book, Full Spectrum Thinking, I made a comment here in my notes, is about recognizing patterns, seeking clarity, and resisting certainty. Wouldn't we want to go back to the joke I made about the lotto numbers, wouldn't we want certainty? Like in 3 years, who's going to win the pennant? I could bet in Las Vegas and win a lot of money, or I could impress my friends. So why do we want to resist that?
So this is our challenge, Bill. Our brains want certainty, but they need clarity. So in a highly uncertain world, I teach at the Army War College now, and what the Army says the future is like is the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's going
Boy, are they right?
It's going to get worse, and that's exactly what we're experiencing in these compounded crises now. So in that kind of mood, our brains want to categorize things, and they want certainty, they want predictability, but in a VUCA world, you can't. So the future will reward clarity, but punish certainty, because certainty is too brittle. Command and control is too brittle. We need to be more shape-shifting. We need to be very clear where we're going, but very flexible how we get there.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the future will punish categorical thinking, but reward full spectrum thinking. First of all, can you explain what categorical thinking is?
So the way our brains work, and this book is actually a very optimistic book in a frightening time. And it's optimistic because our brains need to categorize. But in a VUCA world, it's so dangerous to categorize simplistically. But now, over the next decade, we're going to have practical digital tools to help us see the full spectrum of possibilities. And full spectrum thinking is to seek your own clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptations of certainty. Because if you lock down on just one idea or one category, and then the world shifts around you. And, Bill, we've seen that just in the last 6 months. We have the novel coronavirus, and now we have the social justice crisis, where our world is just tumbling around us. So it's a VUCA world already. It's going to get worse. So what we need to do is to look long, to seek our clarity, to say, okay, what's the direction you want to pursue? And then be very flexible about how we get there. So it's not that leadership goes away. Leadership becomes more important, but it also has to be more flexible. So, in the crisis, you look for the people around you who are being clear, but not certain. And just think about that. As you listen to the news about the COVID crisis, listen for the people who are clear. So people like Bill Gates, for example, he was very clear about the risk of pandemics in 2015. But very few people listened. I work with Microsoft, and they're using this book, actually. And Microsoft was much more prepared than most companies because they listened to Bill Gates. It was their founder, but it wasn't confidential. He wrote this all publicly. But our governments, our companies, most of them just didn't pay attention. So listen for the people who are clear. Anthony Fauci is clear. Deborah Birx is clear. Many of the politicians are certain but not clear. And again, I'm not an expert on the present. I'm a humble futurist. I don't talk about politics. But what I can't help but see with today's political environment is we're so polarized, and politicians of both parties are certain, but they're often not clear.
That was so, as I'm reading your book, I'm underlining and highlighting, and I'm saying to myself, this guy is really, really smart. I mean, when you said that, because we would all like certainty. I just heard someone complaining this morning on the radio just about what you were talking about, that why is he saying this? Why is he saying that? Because we don't know. It's something novel. It's new. It's changing day by day. And the more I hear people doing things, I'm saying, oh my gosh, why would you do that? But what you bring out, now you also use the term scrambled future. Is that the same as what you were just talking about?
Yes, basically, the VUCA world is a kind of Army acronym, and it works with some people, it doesn't work with others, but it's essentially a scramble. What it means is that things are scrambled, and they're going to get even worse. And, it's kind of like the old story. Once you scramble the eggs, you can't unscramble them. and this is a scrambled future. We can't unscramble it. We can't pretend it's there. We can't pretend that we can go back to simpler times. It's not going to work. Instead, we have to figure out how can we be clear in this world without being certain.
And that's another good point. We all say, oh, we'd like to go back to the good old days or simpler times. We don't get that choice, I guess, unless we're going to move to the woods or another planet or someplace. So
that's right.
We have to put up with what we have. Bob, I'd like our audience to know, if you're just tuning in, this very smart man we're talking to today is Bob Johansen. He's the author of Full Spectrum Thinking. And Bob, if you can tell us, where can we get that book and the website?
Well, it's everywhere now. It's on Amazon. It's just called Full Spectrum Thinking. It's on all the outlets. It's also in an audiobook. And Bill, this is my 12th book, and this is the first time I recorded my own audiobook. And it was a great experience. And audiobooks are such an interesting medium now. And it's so much different as an author to not just be writing, but to be speaking your book. So if your audience is attracted to audiobooks, they might want to go that route. And it's on all the Audible and iTunes and all the other channels for audiobooks. It's just called Full Spectrum Thinking.
And give us that website again.
The website is iftf.org. It's Institute for the Future. So you can
Institute for the Future. Yeah. And to our audience, I'm Bill Horan. Our guest, as I said, is Bob Johansen. And you're listening to us, The Secrets of Success, on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. Bob, isn't it easier for us to jump into that categorical thinking? Because this sounds like it's going to be like exercise, a little bit tougher. It's going to exercise our mind. As you said, it's not a definite answer. We would like the good old days, but that's not the answer that's going to win for us. Do we kind of default to, let's just jump into a category? I hate this and I like peas and carrots.
Sure. No, it's the natural thing. And, this book is so grounded in neuroscience and our brains. I did the keynote for the Neuro Leadership Summit in New York City just last year. And they actually assigned a neuroscientist to kind of follow me around. And whenever I spoke, he interpreted. So I would say things like, well, you can't predict the future. And this is Kevin Oxner, the neuroscientist from Columbia, amazing guy. So Kevin follows me around and he says, yeah, it's true, Bob. You can't predict the future, but our brains try to do it every day anyway. They're always trying to predict. Are we going to get in trouble? How can we stay safe? So our brains are always predicting, but we have to teach our brains new tricks. We have to teach our brains that categorizing people, for example, as blacks or as immigrants or as whites or as old people, categories can get us in a lot of trouble. Now, it's fine if people choose to use their own categories as a form of identity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about labeling others. So, for example, in the book, I give the example of autism. It used to be that when someone had the condition that we've called autism, they were labeled as autistic. And in many cases, it meant kind of writing them off. It's labeling them something. Well, they're autistic. They can't do anything. Now, what the medical community does, using full spectrum thinking, is they call it autism spectrum disorders. And you're on the spectrum. And there's some things that are bad about it and some things that are good. And we actually see in Silicon Valley now, we get people applying for jobs at Institute for the Future who say on their resume, I'm on the spectrum, as testimony to the fact that they can think differently. Because, we're a think tank. We want people who can think differently. And now you've got some of the big high-tech companies actually looking for people on the spectrum because of certain abilities that they have that the so-called neuronormal people don't have. So it's not saying there aren't problems with being on the spectrum. It's just saying that, yeah, it's a spectrum and you can fall at different points on the spectrum. And there's actually some good things about it.
And that's amazing. And I was just going to say that those people and anybody is going to see the world differently. If you're a religious leader, there's going to be some different or taint to it. A baseball player or an astronaut. We're all looking at things so differently. You mentioned that full spectrum thinking is about pattern recognition. Could you give us an example of that?
Sure. So by pattern recognition, what's happening is in data and big data analytics now, everything is becoming visual. So, when I did my PhD program, I was taught statistics, and everything had to be kind of pulled out and put into a statistic and turned into some kind of normal curve, as they're called. Now what happens is people go actually in the data set and see the full spectrum of data possibilities. So, for example, we did a custom forecast for GSK, the big pharma company, before the virus. And one of the things we identified there was that data will become increasingly important for health and for public health in particular. And then, of course, the COVID-19 crisis hits. And instead of just thinking about data for bad, which it's true, data can be misused and security and privacy and all that. So that I'm not denying those at all. But there's a whole set of scenarios around data for good. So now in the post-outbreak world, it's becoming obvious because of this ability to visualize these very large data sets, public health data sets, that we have to have data and that it can be for good. So I call this restart from zero, where you're happening after the crisis. We're not coming back to where we were. We're restarting from zero. And in this case, it's asking, well, what's the value of data? And we know now for public health, we need data to track the virus. And that data can't just be local. It can't just be national. It has to be global. And it has to be increasingly visualized and not categorized simplistically. And Bill, just to give a quick example on that, we're so questing, even in the midst of this crisis, we want to categorize so hard that there's this effort to try to categorize people as either immune or not. Immune or not. Well, it ain't that simple. It's a spectrum, and it changes all the time. So the testing has to happen more frequently, and it's a spectrum of preparedness, a spectrum of immunity. It's not binary. It's not an either or choice. It's a spectrum. And we got to get used to it. And the good news is the tools are going to help us to do that. And we don't have to learn these exotic statistics anymore. We can actually see the distribution.
It's fantastic talking to you, because I'm thinking of this and I'm saying, as I listen to the radio, someone saying he's wrong because he said this or he said that. And I'm thinking just what you said now. They're trying to put it into a box, and they want everything to be good or bad or red or yellow. And It just doesn't work that way. That's why I love your book, Full Spectrum Thinking. And I didn't know it was in audio, but I think anybody who, even if they're not readers, if they're out walking, jogging, or at the gym, their life has to improve if they have this, and to realize, and things just what you've been talking about. You mentioned in your book the job of a forecaster is to provoke, not predict. What does that mean? What are you provoking me to do?
Right. Well, I'm provoking your insight. So, quick example that I talk about in the book, and I now have permission to talk about because it's become public. But we did a custom forecast for Procter & Gamble in the early days of biotech. And we came in and said, biotech's going to change your business, disrupt it profoundly, particularly in detergents and healthcare. And I presented it to the CEO at the time. He looked around the table at his top 12 people and said, do any of you have enough background in biotech to make good business decisions? The answer was no. That was the insight. That was the aha. The action was what they call the biotech reverse mentoring program, where they paired the top 12 people at Procter & Gamble with young PhD level biotech scientists. And they met once a month for a year. Some of these executives went into labs for the first time. Some of these young scientists went on the executive floor for the first time, changed their lives. At the end of the year, they hired a new chief technology officer from the outside, very rare at P&G. Shortly thereafter, there was a new CEO who had been one of those 12, A.G. Lafley, and his mentor became the head of sustainability. So now at P&G, biotech is everywhere, particularly in those two businesses. But it began with this forecast where there was a provocation from the outside, not a prediction. It didn't say this will happen. It said this is likely to disrupt your business. And the insight was, we're not prepared. And the action was, we got to get prepared. And we're going to do it through this unique reverse mentoring program.
I think that's brilliant. I thought you were going to say the business people was going to say, bah, humbug. we don't want to be bothered by that. It's disrupting our daily world. But how brilliant that man was to listen to you, and what a great accolade to your company, the Institute for the Future, or the Institute itself, that they had enough confidence in what you said to go with it and use it properly and keep themselves in the lead in their industry.
Yeah, they did the hard part. All we, it's actually easier, Bill, to look 10 years ahead than it is 1 or 2 years ahead. It just takes discipline, and it takes what we call future back thinking. So another quick example, if you look 10 years ahead now, biotech, this custom forecast was done 20 years ago. But now, looking 10 years ahead to 2030, there'll be sensors everywhere. They'll be very cheap. Many of them will be connected, and some of them will be in our bodies. That's just obvious. It's easier to look 10 years ahead than 1 or 2 years ahead. What's not obvious is who's going to make money for that? How do we get from here to there in this world of ubiquitous sensors? But the future is quite clear if we only look at it.
I would love to spend a day or a week or a month just following you and listening to the people talking to you and what you have to say. And Bob, with that in mind, I want our audience to know, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Bill Horan. Our guest today is Bob Johansen, Johansen. The book is Full Spectrum Thinking. Please write that down. You're going to want to get it. You're going to want to look at it and say, oh my gosh, this guy has been right about what he's saying. And if all these companies are hiring him and people from the Institute for the Future, they must know something. Bob, tell us, where can we get Full Spectrum Thinking, and also the website where we can learn more?
Well, if you just Google Full Spectrum Thinking, it'll give you all your local sources. It's, of course, on Amazon and audiobooks, Audibles, and those sorts of media. It's everywhere now. My publisher rushed it out because it's so relevant to the crisis we're facing now. Not only the COVID crisis, but also the social justice crisis, which is, racism is a lot about categorizing.
And I have to say, as I read your book, I'm saying, oh my gosh, this is just so good. And I'm underlining, and we call it a dirty book. That's what I call it. When I make a lot of markings, our audience knows that's a good sign. But I really felt honored to be reading it. And I said, I can't wait to talk to this guy. I just hope I'm smart enough to talk to him for 30 minutes and not look really stupid. So hope I haven't blown it yet.
Not at all. You're doing great.
Bob, you mentioned the best forecasts are the ones we don't like. Why is that? I would think I should like it.
Yeah. So let's take the issue of climate disruption, or we're calling it climate destabilization now. We did our first study of climate in 1977. So we've been thinking about this a long time. And, we're not an advocacy group. So we're not advocating any particular future, but we're really good at finding the world's best experts in any topic, aggregating their opinions, and then doing a future back analysis, what we call a core forecast, and then doing scenarios off of that. So it's obvious that climate has been an issue for a very long time. Now we have to somehow translate that into what is actually doable out of that. So how can we look long to make sense of that, and then use that to provoke people's insight? So I hope we're wrong about that. And yet with climate, we continue to make these forecasts. Bill Gates did it in 2015, and yet we're having trouble getting people's attention. Now, I hope one of the silver linings out of the COVID crisis is that it's obvious, if you look at this with any depth at all, that pandemics are linked to climate disruption. That there's
I would say that, yeah, and that's what I'm seeing from TV, but yeah, you're the expert.
There's definitely a link there. So the latest things out of Johns Hopkins suggest we're going to face the rolling risk of pandemics about every 3 years going forward. Now, I hope they're wrong. I hope we're wrong about climate disruption. So in that sense, some of the most important forecasts are those that make you upset, that you argue with the forecast, that you hope it's not true. And here to get back to where we started on the difference between us and fortune tellers, our forecast will be a success if it doesn't happen.
Okay, fair enough. That really is true. Now, I saw something in your book. There's future forces, and I think there's three big ones that we should be alert to.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about those and what they are?
I can. So we started talking about one. It's climate disruption, and climate destabilization may be a better name for it, but we're already seeing it with extreme weather. The second is the rich-poor gap. And by the way, pandemics are a subset of climate disruption for us. And the second is the rich-poor gap. It's hard to do a forecast 10 years out where the rich-poor gap narrows. It's easy to do a forecast where it widens. That is unsustainable. So we've got a group at Institute for the Future now. You can see them on the website that's looking at equitable futures. And part of their most recent data is this is before the crisis, before the COVID crisis. Roughly half of Americans had zero assets. Zero assets. So it isn't just jobs, it's assets. And in that case now, the COVID virus has been extremely unfair. It's made that worse. So if you're poor, it's hit you harder. If you're Black, it's hit you harder. If you're Hispanic, it's hit you harder. So it's unfair. So that rich-poor gap, and that links to racism, it links to a whole series of issues that are linked to poverty. The final is global terrorism and cyber terrorism. And here, I'm not a military guy by background, but I've been volunteering with the Army War College since 9/11. And now I've been promoted to the point where I teach the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington. And they read this book. And I've learned so much from them. But what we're seeing there is we've moved from, in the Vietnam War, this was what they describe as their turning point, where command and control no longer worked, and they were encountering asymmetrical warfare. And now it's cyber amplified, digital amplified cyber warfare. That's really frightening. So those combinations of climate, of rich-poor, and of cyber terrorism, those are the three big external future forces that I'm most concerned about. And, you know, I summarize, and I've been doing this a long time, I've more than 30 years. This is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever done, and it's the most hopeful. And a lot of that links to the connectivity. The connectivity makes things worse. The connectivity can make things better.
Bob, I can't tell you how interesting. I wish we had a 24-hour show today because we would have even more fun. I'd be willing to buy you both lunch and dinner to keep going. For our audience, again, I want them to know the book is Full Spectrum Thinking. Our guest today has been Bob Johansen. His name is spelled Johansen. And Bob, again, I'm going to ask you where we can get the book and the website, because I think people will want to know more about this. And obviously dealing with a very impressive man who's advising both the generals and the businesses. So you know the path we're going on, and it perhaps can help some of our listeners.
I hope so. I am really optimistic about the future if we have hope. And in particular, the kids, I think, are bringing that. The kids are growing up with digital skills and with values. You know, they don't see categories in the kind of more blind way that older people like us do sometimes. The kids, I think, have a great advantage. They're growing up digital, and they're growing up concerned about values and concerned about how to make the future a better place. So the book's called Full Spectrum Thinking. Our group is called Institute for the Future. If you just Google that, you'll see the links to the book website and to the work that the Institute is doing. We're a nonprofit think tank, and we share the results of what we're doing. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'd like our audience to know that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at this same time when we will continue our journey to success.